We're 4 years on from Uruguay in 1930, so let's continue our journey and see if the Second World Cup was free of socio-economic issues. For the 1934 tournament, we're heading to Italy. Let's quickly see who's in charge there. Right. In case you're joining the journey here, let me just quickly introduce what this is all about. When every World Cup rolls around, familiar echoes plead or demand that the tournament be left as a beacon of pure footballing joy. These calls come from across the spectrum, from those in power to people in stadiums, pubs, and living rooms. But how realistic or logical is this position? Well, I'm rattling through every World Cup to find out whether or not external factors like social movements and political issues have had any influence on events. These aren't complete tournament overviews or even full histories. I'm diving deep enough to see if the apolitical stance has ever been achieved. Right, let's get started with Italy in 1934. FIFA's executive committee met 8 times before selecting Italy as the host nation for the 1934 World Cup. They finally plumped for the peninsula on the 7th of October 1932. But the committee made the decision themselves. They didn't ballot their members. The only other bid on the table at any point was from Sweden. In the words of Jim Hart, writing for These Football Times, the decision to award Italy hosting rights was fraught with political intrigue and rumours of intimidation and illegal payment. According to Hart, as early as 1930, an informal lobbying effort was undertaken by the Secretary for the Italian Football Federation, Giovanni Mauro, on behalf of the fascist government to assure the organisation that the Italian government would underwrite any losses incurred during the tournament. As Hart points out then, following the establishment of the World Cup, it hadn't taken long for FIFA to earn a growing reputation as an organisation with less than pure sporting ideals. From the Italian perspective, their failure to secure the 1930 tournament had been a stinging blow. Mussolini's propaganda machine was in full swing, promoting the superiority of Italy and its people. To lose out to Uruguay, a small country with a fraction of its population, was an embarrassment for the regime. For the 1934 tournament, they simply weren't prepared to leave anything to chance. Mussolini's regime was in no doubt. The World Cup was the perfect platform to demonstrate the success of fascism in Italy and to win over more admirers and converts at home and abroad. Fascism rose in Europe in the 1920s, and Italy was the standard bearer for the ideology. Following the March on Rome, which saw tens of thousands of fascists descend on the capital, King Victor Emmanuel III appointed Mussolini as the Prime Minister of the country on the 28th of October 1922. Inevitably, though, Mussolini consolidated power, ultimately establishing a dictatorship. He bestowed himself with the title Head of Government, or Il Duce, on the 24th of December 1925. For fans of verbosity, his full title was His Excellency Benito Mussolini, Head of Government, Leader of Fascism, and Founder of the Empire. It's easy to forget how young a nation Italy was at this time. It had only officially unified as a kingdom on the 17th of March 1861, and the process wasn't fully completed for another decade. Unification marked the culmination of the Risorgimento, a period of social and political movements aimed at bringing together the various states spread across the Italian peninsula. But despite becoming a unified kingdom, Italy was still defined by deep regionalism. The phenomenon of campanilismo, which, broadly speaking, is the intense pride and affection many Italians feel for their hometowns and regions, was central to this. The term derives from campanile, which translates as bell tower, often associated with churches. The feeling can be broken down, somewhat crudely, into my church tower is better than your church tower. As Mussolini rose to power, these often bitter local and regional rivalries represented a problem. Il Duce needed to craft a new national identity, namely one based on strength, organization, nationalism, militarism, a belief in natural social hierarchy, and the subordination of individual rights to the state's perceived interests. Football, and sports in general, proved a highly useful tool for connecting with the common man. A Human Rights Foundation article titled A History of Sports and Dictators, Part 2, The Rise of Fascism, breaks it down rather succinctly. Mussolini pioneered the weaponization of sports for political propaganda, social control, and international soft power projection. In this vein, the fascist regime developed centralized national policies to transform Italian society into a sports nation, linking sports to the forging of a new national identity, health, and military readiness. But despite football's popularity, there was a nagging issue. Like the nation itself, the game in Italy was regionalized. Clubs took part in a competition called Prima Categoria, with the winners of each regional group participating in a playoff to declare the national champion. Because of the enormous disparities in facilities and resources between the North and South, this champion was almost always a northern team. This regionalism led to disagreements about professionalism and the reduction of bloated regional leagues. In the 1921-22 season, there was even a split. The richest clubs in the north, including Juventus, Milan, Pro Vercelli, and Bologna, created the CCI to rule over their new competition, Prima Divisione. This was a splinter league from the established Prima Categoria, overseen by the FIGC. This created two rival championships and even two different national champions. This wasn't just confusing for the fans, but an embarrassment for Italian football. While the two leagues merged back together after only one season, tensions persisted around professionalism, club power, and regional inequalities. With his power consolidated, Mussolini seized control of the situation. He issued the Carta di Viareggio, or Viareggio Charter, on the 2nd of August 1926. This document transformed Italian football. The charter abolished the regional format, creating the Divisione Nazionale that included the best teams from across the country. This national league system was vital to creating a strong sense of a unified Italy. As part of the restructuring, the regime encouraged the formation of large, powerful clubs to the south of the northern giants to promote genuine competition. In some cases, municipalities insisted upon these mergers. These new teams would represent some of Italy's largest and most important cities on a national stage, creating institutions that citizens could feel proud of and rally behind. Fiorentina were formed in 1926 by merging two Florentine clubs, CS Firenze and PG Libertas. As a result, Florence became a one-club city. Further south, AS Roma were founded in August 1927 by merging three smaller existing clubs in the capital. Lazio managed to avoid becoming involved in this process, ensuring Rome remained a two-club city. But the Viareggio Charter went even further. To fully expunge foreign elements from the newly unified national game, the regime Italianized some club names and even individual terms. In 1928, Internazionale, founded in 1908 with an explicitly internationalist ethos, merged with US Milanese and were renamed Società Sportiva Ambrosiana. In 1932, this name was later tweaked to Ambrosiana Inter under pressure from fans and club management before reverting back to Inter after the war. Milan Football Club became Associazione Calcio Milano, emphasizing the Italian form. As at Inter, Milano was resisted by supporters, but eventually the club settled on AC Milan with an Italian structure and English spelling. In 1928, Genoa Cricket and Football Club was also Italianized into Genova 1893 Circolo del Calcio. And footballing terminology changed too, eradicating Anglicisms in favor of Italian words. This was part of a broader fascist campaign of linguistic reclamation. Football became calcio, match, partita, goalkeeper, portiere, goal, rete, corner, calcio d'angolo, penalty, calcio di rigore, and offside became fuori gioco. Within a handful of years, football had become a tool of fascist unity. The Divisione Nazionale only ran for 3 seasons, replaced by Serie A for the 1929-30 campaign. And while Ambrosiana Inter won the first title, Juventus claimed the next 5. The 4th championship in that sequence led into the 1934 World Cup, and to no one's surprise, there were 9 Juve players included in the squad. 2-star names in that all-conquering Juve team were Luis Monti and Raimundo Orsi. Both were born and raised in Argentina and played hundreds of games in the domestic league there. The two men also received numerous caps for the Argentina national team. You may remember from the previous video in this series that Monti even starred in the 1930 World Cup for the Albiceleste. However, Orsi and Monti were both tempted to Italy by huge wage offers. Orsi signed for Juventus in 1928, with Monti following him to the Old Lady in 1931. Enrique Guaita and Attilio De Maria, both Argentine nationals, and Anfilogino Guarisi, a Brazilian by birth, also made the lucrative move from South America to Italy, transferring to Roma, Inter, and Lazio, respectively. Like Monti, De Maria had also represented Argentina at the 1930 World Cup. All 5 of these men were part of the Italy squad in 1934, with Monti, Orsi, and Guaita starting the final. They, and many others, were known as oriundi, or returners. The term refers to individuals born outside of Italy to Italian immigrant parents or grandparents, who were then eligible to become naturalized Italian citizens and play for the Italian national team. While it's impossible to put a definitive number on it, it's widely estimated that hundreds of players with Italian heritage made the journey from South America to Italy during the 1920s and 30s thanks to the enormous wages on offer. The amounts dwarfed what they had previously earned and even placed some players in a higher pay bracket than Italian lawyers and doctors. This flow of talent only further strained relations between Latin America and Europe, weakening not only the domestic leagues, but national teams. But how did the oriundi fit with the anti-foreign sentiment in Italy at the time? Well, it wasn't always seamless. Augusto Ragone, national team manager between 1925 and 28, had been forbidden from calling up Argentina-born Julio Libonati, despite the fact that he had already played for the Azzurri. Primarily, this was due to fears about his professional status, but there was also a strong hint that he wasn't Italian enough for Mussolini's project. Jonathan Wilson goes on to note that, after taking charge of the national side for the 3rd time, Vittorio Pozzo pushed back against any such interference in his plans. In The Power and the Glory, Wilson explains that Pozzo had argued vehemently that he should be allowed to call up oriundi. How could it be, he asked, that they were eligible for national service but not for the national team? The oriundi's Italian heritage offered a convenient workaround. As is usually the way of these things, there was inevitable talk about blood. Because these men had Italian blood pumping through their veins, they were ultimately deemed worthy to join the cause. In fact, oriundi were broadly framed as New World colonizers returning home, rather than the children of poor migrants who had been forced to flee grinding poverty for the hope of something better on the other side of the world. The attempted interference from above didn't stop there. Achille Starace, known as the High Priest of the cult of Il Duce, demanded that Pozzo only pick fascist party members in his squad. Despite only wanting to pick 3 non-members, Pozzo again pushed back and said he would pick whoever he wanted. This was Pozzo's 3rd stint as national team manager, so he was more determined than ever to do things his way. This long, winding road demonstrates just how long Mussolini's regime had been preparing the groundwork for making Italy a footballing force. They were in it for the long haul, pouring massive investment into everything from new stadium construction and existing ground renovations to building infrastructure to help fans reach them on match days. And speaking of stadiums, many ended up carrying fascist-related names. You may remember that Napoli's Stadio Giorgio Ascarelli, named after the club's late Jewish owner, was renamed Stadio Partenopeo after renovations for the World Cup, a nod to Naples' founding as a Greek settlement. But there were plenty more, including the Stadio Benito Mussolini in Turin, Stadio del Littoriale in Bologna, and Stadio Berta in Florence. The fascist regime put aside a 3.5 million lire budget for hosting the World Cup. Much of this spending was taking place in the aftermath of the 1929 New York stock market crash and during the ensuing economic depression, which was one of the worst in recorded history. But Italy had come too far, spent too much money, and put in too much effort to let this golden opportunity for mass propaganda go to waste. The spending could all be justified as investments in Italy's international prestige, although the severity of the situation was typically played down. General Giorgio Vaccaro, FIGC president, described hosting as an opportunity to showcase the organizational efficiency of fascist sport in general, and football in particular, highlighting, in times of so-called crisis, our infinite national resources. During this long build-up to the tournament, the Italian national team had developed into a genuine force. The players were primed, poised, and ready to participate for the title of world champions. 36 nations entered the tournament, necessitating qualifying to narrow down the field. For the first and only time in World Cup history, even the hosts had to qualify. The far greater interest in 1934 not only demonstrated the popularity of the competition, but also how much easier it was to persuade countries to get involved when the tournament was staged in Europe. With the hosts having to qualify for the finals, Italy were paired in a two-team group with Greece in what was essentially a two-legged playoff. On the 25th of March 1934, the Azzurri defeated the Greeks 4-0, inspired by Giuseppe Meazza. But the second game didn't take place. On record, the Greeks withdrew, declining to play. However, it was later reported that the Italians covered the financial loss Greece incurred due to the game not happening. They also bought a house in Athens and gifted it to the Greek Football Association to use as their HQ. So, Italy had booked their spot. But who else was there? Let's start with the defending world champions, Uruguay. As mentioned in the 1930 video, they had taken offense at how many teams from Europe decided to ignore their tournament. So they returned the favor. The reigning world champions surrendered their crown on principle. However, the ongoing economic crisis after the Wall Street crash, the aftermath of a military coup in 1933, and the passing of their footballing golden age certainly helped make the decision easier. Chile and Peru joined La Celeste, publicly declaring their boycott was out of solidarity with the Uruguayans. The tournament was also a straight knockout format from the start, so any team that lost in the first round was one and done. This was hardly a tempting prospect for South American teams making the mammoth journey to Italy. As such, Brazil and Argentina were the continent's only representatives. But despite all the effort required to travel, Argentina sent a weakened squad. This was partly driven by a desire to avoid Italian clubs poaching more of their players, as well as a retaliation against the poor European turnout at the 1930 World Cup. They lost their first-round match to Sweden. And what were the British up to this time? Well, the home nations still weren't FIFA members at this point, but they were invited nevertheless. They all declined, citing their busy tournament schedule at home as the reason. At this point, they still saw the home nations championship as more important than the World Cup. FA Secretary Frederick Wall also recalled unhappy memories of an away game in Rome in 1933 and claimed, "I have no desire again to be a guest of the Italian Football Federation." The British home nations were also still in disagreement with FIFA about rules around amateurism. But this wasn't an isolated case. Football wasn't included at the 1932 Olympics at all. This time, it was FIFA and the IOC at loggerheads about the amateur restrictions at the Games. Football would return for the 1936 Olympics in Berlin, but we'll come back to that later. With qualifiers complete, the nations competing in Italy were Argentina, Austria, Belgium, Brazil, Czechoslovakia, Egypt, France, Germany, Hungary, Italy, the Netherlands, Romania, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, and the United States. As with the pre-tournament groundwork stretching back years, the fascist regime pulled out all the stops for the tournament itself. Achille Starace was the face of the competition. He wanted to inundate the population with fascist iconography masquerading as promotional materials and memorabilia. Over 300,000 posters with fascist-themed art were printed and plastered up around the country. Special stamps were issued, and they even introduced a new brand of cigarettes called Campeonato del Mondo, or World Championship. Get that World Cup tar in your lungs. The match tickets were produced on high-quality paper too, with the intention of them becoming treasured souvenirs. While we're on the topic of tickets, early sales weren't necessarily booming, so Mussolini performed the stunt of queuing up outside a stadium box office with ordinary folk before Italy's opening game against the USA. He supposedly bought tickets for himself and his family. Of course, he didn't actually need or use them. He took his seat in the VIP area among the other dignitaries, wearing his yachting cap. And then there was the Coppa del Duce. Not one for understatement. Mussolini's desire to showcase his country led him to commission an additional trophy to be presented alongside the World Cup. Not only did Mussolini name it after himself, but, quote, its dimensions dwarfed the real thing. Make no mistake, this was a tournament with a message, and it wasn't subtle. Everything was stage managed to ensure that fascism had as much time in the spotlight as possible. Even FIFA president Jules Rimet noted, "I have the impression that it was not FIFA that really organized the World Cup, but Mussolini." But maybe the matches themselves weren't so saturated with symbolism. Okay, well, this isn't a full tournament review, so let's skip to the quarterfinals. The draw pitted Italy against Spain in a match that became known as the Battle of Florence. It was exceptionally violent and ill-disciplined. Spain took the lead after 30 minutes. Italy thought they had equalized from a corner, but the referee, Louis Bayet of Belgium, ruled it out for a foul on the legendary Spanish goalkeeper, Ricardo Zamora. The Italian players protested that the goal should have stood, so the referee changed his mind and awarded it. Cue counter-protests from Spain, but to no avail. In the second half, Langara scored for Spain, only for the referee to rule it out following a controversial offside. The game ended in a draw, the events of the day fueling Spanish talk of robbery and stealing. The two teams returned for a replay the following day. Having been targeted with rough treatment in the first game, Zamora was ruled out with a black eye and swollen knee, along with 6 other Spaniards. Mario Pizzaiolo also missed out for Italy, having broken his leg, another sign of how violent the game had been. Italy won the replay 1-0 thanks to another controversial goal, the Spaniards again protesting about a foul on the goalkeeper, allowing them to march on to the semi-final. René Mercier of Switzerland officiated the replay. In addition to Italy's questionable goal, he disallowed 2 for Spain. The French sports daily L'Auto wrote, "The referee conducted the operations with such casualness that he frequently appeared to be Italy's 12th man." After the tournament, Mercier was struck off by the Swiss Football Association and FIFA. He never refereed again. It's worth noting at this point that, despite numerous reports of highly questionable, one-sided officiating, no corruption has ever officially been uncovered. None of Italy's opponents submitted any formal complaints. And while this Azzurri side had a reputation as being highly physical, that's not so out of keeping with how many clubs and national sides played at the time. In addition to Mario Pizzaiolo's broken leg, Italy's superstar and the tournament's best player, Giuseppe Meazza, also suffered on the field. He was carried off in the quarter-final and semi-final and played in the final, spoiler alert, with a prominent limp due to a serious injury. Maybe Italy were just one of the most brutal of a violent bunch? Sadly, there isn't much video footage to help corroborate this, or the claims of corruption. Anyway, back to the football. Austria's famous Wunder team, led by superstar forward Matthias Sindelar, awaited Italy in the semi-final. Sadly for this wonderful Austrian side, their peak came more around 1932 between the 2 World Cups. While they were still a formidable opponent in 1934, their slick passing game was hampered by the appalling state of the San Siro pitch. And, in a continuation of a theme, there was a highly contentious goal. Writing in The Guardian, John Ashdown writes, "On a San Siro pitch that was a bobbly bog patched with sand and with rain teeming down, Italy took an early lead. Peter Platzer, in goal for the injured Rudi Hayden, collected a low cross, felt the full force of Meazza's challenge, and Enrique Guaita poked home. Despite Austria's protests at Meazza's challenge, the goal was given. The game ended 1-0 and Italy progressed to the final, thanks in no small part to one of its oriundo. Much like Ricardo Zamora had been targeted for rough treatment in the previous round, Sindelar, known as the Paperman due to his slight build, was kicked off the pitch. In fact, Luis Monti was allowed to dominate Sindelar to such an extent that the Austrian had to visit an orthopedic clinic after the game. Pozzo even wrote him a letter of apology. After the game, Hugo Meisel, Austria's coach, said, "It was impossible to beat Italy in such a context. You have to give up and grant the title to the Azzurri, but this does not mean that their football is better and that the title is deservedly achieved." How about some off-field rumours to spice up the mix even more? After the tournament, it was rumoured that Mussolini himself had dinner with the referee, Ivan Eklund, the night before the semi-final, but only to talk tactics. Remarkably, there was even a claim from an Austrian player that Eklund intercepted a pass, knocking it down for an Italian. Jonathan Wilson addresses this aspect of the tournament in The Power and the Glory. There are plenty of rumours about Ivan Eklund, the Swedish referee, the youngest official at the tournament, and it perhaps says something about his performance that he was promptly installed to take charge of the final. Certainly, it's hard to imagine that happening had he been perceived as too strict on Italy. Wilson goes on to point out that Eklund was also a surprise pick for the World Cup, as it was expected that the more experienced Otto Olsson would go. It seems that Eklund was a friend of Anton Johansson, the Swedish FA's FIFA representative and a noted political climber. Eklund's youth and inexperience could be seen as making him more pliable, and Johansson had already created warm relations with Italy by withdrawing Sweden's bid to host the tournament. All this said, there is no concrete evidence that Eklund was paid off or in any other way corrupted. In fact, he went on to have a successful refereeing career and officiated at the 1938 and 1950 tournaments. Surprisingly, an Italian referee was selected to oversee the other semi-final between Germany and Czechoslovakia. The Czechs were considered the weaker side, making them a preferable opponent for Italy in the final, should they get there, of course. Again, reports from the time highlight questionable refereeing decisions, this time in favour of the Czechs, who would run out 3-1 winners. So, it all came down to a final between Italy and Czechoslovakia. On the day of the game, the 10th of June 1934, the Czechoslovakian government announced an alliance with the Soviet Union. This was an effort to seek protection from the growing threats of fascism and Nazism in Europe. As a vehement anti-communist, Mussolini was infuriated by the news. However, there was also an opportunity here. A victory in the final would hold even greater glory for the Italian state by defeating an opponent now allied with the Soviet Union. While it probably would have been the case anyway, the atmosphere at the final, played in Rome's Stadio Nazionale del PNF, which essentially translates to the National Fascist Party Stadium, was frenzied. According to Italy historian Simon Martin, the final was equated in the press to a fascist rally rather than a World Cup final. As touched on above, Ivan Eklund followed up his semi-final duties with the honour of officiating the showpiece event. He was only 28 years old, still the youngest man to have overseen a World Cup final. Some reports claim he was invited into the stadium's VIP box before kick-off to meet with Mussolini and other high-ranking members of the regime. But there is no direct implication that any corruption took place. The Italians' rough, aggressive play and brute force overwhelmed the Czechs. The Azzurri were losing 1-0 with 10 minutes to go, but Oriundo Orsi equalised, forcing the game into extra time. Angelo Schiavio put the Azzurri 2-1 up, and they held on for victory. With his appearance in the final, Luis Monti became the only player to appear in consecutive World Cup finals for different countries: Argentina in 1930 and Italy in 1934. And according to the man himself, Monti's presence in both games wasn't the only repeat. In the video for the 1930 tournament, I shared quotes from Monti's granddaughter about the death threats he had received before facing Uruguay. Well, she had similar claims about the final 4 years later too. She said that, "My grandfather often told us that he had to play 2 World Cup finals under threat. He told us that before the match against Czechoslovakia in 1934, a person came into the locker room with a message from Mussolini that said there would be consequences if we didn't win. He used to say that in 1930, in Uruguay, they wanted to hurt him if he won. In Italy, 4 years later, they wanted to hurt him if he lost." As with so much about this tournament, and its claims and counterclaims, there's no record of any messages sent or threats made. Does it seem like a possible action by a fascist regime desperate for its home nation to win it all? Yes. Is there anything other than words to prove it? No. Returning to these football times, Jim Hart goes on to explain a little about the post-final whistle scenes. After the final, there was a ceremony where the fascist anthem Giovinezza was played and the presentation of not only the Jules Rimet trophy, but also the special cup which Mussolini had commissioned, 6 times larger than the World Cup itself, was presented to the Azzurri. Mussolini also handed the victorious players a signed photo of himself as a reward. Il Duce had witnessed the ultimate victory he had always envisioned. How pure it is for you to decide. 4 days after the final, Il Duce met Adolf Hitler for the first time in Venice, just 16 days before the Night of the Long Knives, during which Hitler assassinated dozens of his opponents within the Nazi Party, consolidating power. While neither man was especially impressed with the other at this point, it set slow wheels in motion. Italy and Germany established an initial political and military alignment with the Rome-Berlin Axis in October 1936, followed by the Pact of Steel in May 1939. Well, this one's easy. The 1934 World Cup in Italy was as clear an example as you can get of an international sporting event being used for overt political gain. Mussolini and his regime hijacked the tournament for the explicit purpose of promoting fascism. John Langenus, the Belgian referee who oversaw the 1930 final, said, "In the majority of countries, the World Cup was called a sporting fiasco because, beside the desire to win, all other sporting considerations were non-existent, and because, moreover, a certain spirit brooded over the whole championship." Unfortunately for the players, this casts an enormous shadow over their achievements. There's no doubt they were an exceptional side. You only have to look at what happened after the World Cup to see just how good they were. Only a few months after the tournament, Italy travelled to London to play England at Highbury. In England, at least, the game was billed as the real World Cup final. The match took place on the 14th of November 1934 and was, to continue a theme, renowned for its brutality. Ted Drake broke Luis Monti's foot after only 2 minutes, and although the Italian played on for 15 minutes, he eventually had to come off. With no substitutions, Italy played the rest of the game with 10 men. What's more, England scored all 3 of their goals, while the injured Monti was still on the pitch as the last defender. Italy sought retaliation for Drake's tackle for the remainder of the game. Eddie Hapgood had his nose broken and had to be withdrawn for 15 minutes. While Bowden damaged his ankle, Drake was punched and Brooks suffered a fractured arm. Italy fought valiantly to pull back 2 goals and very nearly equalised, but it finished 3-2 to England. Inevitably, though, the match settled nothing. The violent nature of the game entrenched the isolationist views of many in England, with calls for the 3 Lions to withdraw from all international fixtures. Back in Italy, the Azzurri players were lauded for their bravery. A year later, in 1935, Italy won the Central European Cup, a tournament played with Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Switzerland. As touched on earlier, football returned to the Olympics in Berlin in 1936, and an Italian side won the gold there too. Although this wasn't the same set of players who had won the World Cup 2 years earlier, but a squad of amateurs as per Olympic rules. Still, it shows the depth of footballing quality in Italy at the time. So, while there's no doubt this was a fantastic side, there's no escaping that their success was built on the foundations of a fascist state. This is best represented in the very shirts the players wore. You can see it here. To the left, you have the coat of arms of the House of Savoy, while on the right, you have the fasces. The term fascism is derived from fasces. This symbol consists of a bundle of rods with a protruding axe, a grouping of all the equipment needed to inflict corporal or capital punishment. While the fasces predates Roman times, it became a ubiquitous symbol of Mussolini's fascist Italy. You can also see the fasces on the 1934 World Cup poster here. This linking of the fascist state with the national football team is unavoidable. And given the events reported at the time during the 1934 World Cup, lingering questions remain about what happened. For better or worse, they will never be answered. Next on Italy's radar was the 1938 World Cup. The Azzurri would go into the tournament as holders and one of the favourites, but this time they would be on international territory. More specifically, they would defend their crown in France. Watch the third instalment of this series to see if a World Cup taking place on the brink of a devastating global war was free of socio-political issues. Any early guesses?